Why was everyone ignoring her at the table? She sat quietly, her fork moving through a bowl of quinoa and vegetables, the kind of meal that had become her ritual, the kind that drew comments, the kind that drew laughs. Tonight was no different. Laughter rose from across the room, low at first, then louder, growing bolder because it was easy to mock the quiet one. "Rabbit food," someone called out. Another chimed in. "How? That lettuce going to help you when the wind blows?" The voices belonged to men who had worn the same uniform she once had. Men who carried themselves with bulk, with swagger, with the pride of old battles won. But she didn't look up, not yet. Sarah Martinez had learned the art of stillness long ago. In combat zones, stillness meant survival. Here, in a fluorescent-lit veterans' hall, it meant dignity. She finished a bite, folded her napkin, and kept her breathing steady. Outside, the California evening stretched wide and gold, but inside, her world narrowed to the echoes of old prejudices. "Martinez," Captain Jake's voice boomed across the hall, his grin sharp with cruelty. "Tell me, how the hell did you survive boot camp without meat? How'd you carry anyone? How'd you drag a wounded Marine when all you had in your stomach was grass and good intentions?" The men around him chuckled, shoulders shaking, cups of stale coffee halfway to their lips. They laughed like this every week, and every week Sarah said nothing. But tonight, something flickered in her chest. Her jaw tightened just slightly as she clipped her pen into her notebook and slid it into the canvas bag slung over her shoulder. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, as if the weight of their words pressed against her bones. For 3 years she had listened. For 3 years she had endured. She lifted her gaze and met Jake's bloodshot stare. Her voice was quiet but cut clean through the noise. "I guess we'll find out, if it ever comes to that." The room fell silent. Even the coffee pot sputtered to a stop. There it was, the kind of silence born not of respect but of challenge. Sarah had thrown it down gently, but it was there all the same. She had reminded them she'd worn the same uniform, that she had earned the same eagle, globe, and anchor Jake wore on his cap. The mocking ended for the night, but the tension lingered like smoke. And yet, as she walked toward the door, Sarah felt the familiar weight settle back into her chest. The same weight she carried at every meeting. The same question whispered into her mind as she lay awake some nights. Had she lost something since leaving the Corps? Had her gentleness, her choice to live differently, made her less of what she once was? She paused by the bulletin board. Flyers fluttered under the hum of the air vent, hiking trips, bowling nights, volunteer work. Her eyes caught one in particular, a weekend expedition into the Big Sur Mountains. 2 days of hiking, camping, firelight, and old war stories. A chance, the flyer said, to reconnect. Jake would be there, his crew too. Her hand lingered on the flyer. For weeks she had hesitated. The idea of being trapped with them in the wilderness, subject to their endless jokes, their sideways glances, it seemed unbearable. But standing there, their laughter still ringing in her ears, something hardened inside her. She pulled out her phone. One text, one word confirmed. She was going. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in 2 weeks' time the mountain would break wide open, and everything Jake had asked in mockery, "How are you going to carry someone on that rabbit food?" would be answered, not with words, not with arguments, with action, with silence, with a kind of strength they had never understood. But tonight, she walked into the cool air of the California dusk with only one truth in her chest. She was tired of being dismissed, tired of being underestimated, tired of having her worth measured by the weight of her muscles or the food on her plate. The mountain was calling, and Sarah Martinez was ready. The alarm clock read 5:47 a.m. when her eyes opened 3 minutes before it was set to ring. Old habits never died. Her body still operated on military time, even 3 years after discharge. She lay still for a moment, listening. The faint hum of Interstate 5 in the distance. The bark of Mrs. Old Chihuahua next door. Her own steady breathing, in and out, in and out. A rhythm that had become her anchor when nightmares pulled her too deep. Her apartment was small, but everything had a place. The bed was made with corners sharp enough to impress a drill instructor. The bookshelf carried two worlds, veterinary manuals and philosophy texts, and on the wall, three photographs: her boot camp graduation, her squad in Afghanistan, and her grandmother's vegetable garden back home. Sarah moved through her routine with the precision of a soldier, though softer now, transformed by years of healing. 20 minutes of yoga to loosen the scar tissue in her shoulder, a gift from an IED blast outside Kandahar. 30 minutes of meditation to quiet the storms that sometimes rose unbidden in her chest. Then the ritual of food, chopping spinach, scooping quinoa, roasting chickpeas, until the air smelled faintly of turmeric and smoke. It wasn't just fuel, it was discipline, it was medicine, it was one small corner of her life where she held absolute control. She packed her meal carefully, each container stacked with the neatness of someone who had once counted bullets and rations under stress. Then her phone buzzed. A message from Dr. Foster, the support group's facilitator. "Don't let Jake get to you. Your strength shows in ways he'll never understand." Sarah's lips curved into the faintest smile, always new. By 7, she was driving toward her job at the San Humane Society. Past the neat rows of base housing, past the overpasses where homeless veterans gathered in clusters, past reminders of the world she had once belonged to but never fully left behind. Her title was Animal Care Specialist, but to the staff she was more than that. She had a way with creatures no one else could reach. Aggressive dogs calmed under her gaze. Shaken, mistrustful cats learned to trust again. She never forced, never demanded. She sat with them, quiet, present, patient. She knew fear when she saw it, even when it wore the mask of teeth and snarls. That morning they asked her to handle a German shepherd surrendered for aggression. He lunged, barked, his eyes wild. But Sarah just sat cross-legged on the floor outside his kennel. No words, no stares, just stillness, just breath. Minutes passed. Then his barking softened. His body lowered. Eventually, he took a treat from her hand, tail twitching with something like trust. "He's not aggressive," she whispered to a new volunteer watching in awe. "He's scared. Fear and aggression look the same, but you don't fight fear. You listen to it. You steady it." The volunteer nodded, but Sarah was speaking as much to herself as to the dog. Fear had shaped her too. Fear had taught her silence, control, stillness. And yet beneath that there was something harder, forged in heat and blood, the part of her that never broke. Later that afternoon, she sat in the staff garden, her meal neatly packed beside her, her cousin's text glowing on her phone. "Heard you signed up for that camping trip. You sure that's a good idea?" She typed slowly. Someone needs to show them there are different kinds of strength. But what she didn't add, what she couldn't say, was this: she needed to prove it to herself too. Because sometimes, in the quiet hours when the old nightmares pressed heavy on her chest, Sarah wondered if Jake was right. Had she lost something? Had her compassion made her weak? The mountain would give her the answer, one way or another. And soon. Why was he smiling as if the room already belonged to him? Jake stood at the front of the Marine Corps League meeting hall, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the 23 names written on the roster. His shoulders squared the way they always had in uniform, his voice filling the space as if he still commanded a platoon. The hall smelled faintly of old coffee and floor polish, but beneath it all lingered the heavier scent of tradition, of men clinging to the weight of their service like armor they could never shed. "And lady," he added, pausing long enough to draw a chuckle from his circle of friends. His smirk traveled in Sarah's direction like a knife sliding across a table. "We've got 48 hours in some of the toughest, most beautiful terrain California has to offer. 10 miles in, 2 nights, 10 miles out. No Boy Scout trip. This is Marine stuff." The men nodded, chuckled, leaned back in folding chairs. It was all theater, and Jake was in his element. Sarah sat near the back, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face unreadable. She learned not to rise, not to flinch, but every word pressed into her chest, daring her to move. This isn't a spa weekend, Jake continued, his voice rising. We're talking rough terrain, real meals, real teamwork, and I want to know that everyone can pull their weight, because weakness up there, he let the silence stretch. Weakness gets people killed. Eyes turned toward her. Not all at once, not all with malice, but enough. Enough to remind her of the place she occupied in their story. The outsider, the question mark, the one who had to prove she belonged. Jake let his words hang, then leaned on them harder. Now, I'm not naming names, he said, though his gaze lingered openly on Sarah. But some people think rabbit food will get them through the mountains. And me? I want Marines who can carry someone if they go down. I want Marines with strength that doesn't come from spinach and tofu. The laughter came again, though softer this time. Uneasy. Even some of his closest allies shifted in their seats. There was a line, and Jake was walking it. Sarah breathed once, twice, steadying herself. Her pulse stayed calm, but heat rose in her chest. She thought of all the nights she had carried wounded brothers through sand and smoke, of the weight she had lifted when no one else could, of the silence she had kept when all around her was chaos. They didn't know. They never asked. They only saw what was in front of them, her slight frame, her quiet eyes, her meals packed in neat containers. "I'll be there," she said, her voice low, even. A shift passed through the room. She hadn't raised her tone, hadn't snapped back, but something in the steel of her words cut through the bluster. She wasn't asking. She wasn't defending. She was stating. Jake's jaw tightened. He had expected her to excuse herself, to back down, to give him his victory. Instead, she'd planted her flag in silence, and it unsettled him. The meeting moved on, logistics rattled off like a mission brief, tents, supplies, weather warnings. But the air had changed. Sarah had spoken. She had claimed her place. That night, as Sarah packed for the trip, her bag looked almost austere compared to what she imagined the others would bring. No oversized coolers, no grills, no excess. Just what she needed. A tarp, a sleeping bag, layered clothing, and food she'd prepared with care, lentil soup sealed in containers, quinoa mixed with roasted vegetables, energy bars she'd made from oats and seeds. Every item had purpose. Every item carried memory. She folded her clothes with the same precision she'd once used to pack for deployment. Efficiency wasn't just habit, it was survival. But as she checked her bag a final time, doubt pressed at the edges. Would they let her stand beside them? Would she walk into that wilderness only to be mocked again, humiliated deeper, dismissed harder? Her phone buzzed. A message from Mike, the younger Marine who had spoken up at the meeting. "If you need a training partner before the trip, I'm game. Don't let get under your skin." He's loud, not strong. Sarah stared at the words for a long moment. Something in her chest eased. Not everyone was against her. Not everyone believed Jake's version of strength. The next morning, she met Mike at a CrossFit gym. He was quick, sharp, built like a whip. But by the time the workout ended, it was clear who had more left in the tank. Sarah moved like a machine, every pull-up, every squat executed with perfect control. Sweat beaded on her brow, but her breathing stayed steady. "Jesus Martinez," Mike gasped between sets. "Where'd you learn to train like this?" She barely looked up as she reset the barbell. "District. When you're carrying 60 pounds of gear through 120-degree heat, you learn fast." The name alone landed like a stone. The deadliest ground in Afghanistan. Mike's respect grew in silence. He didn't need to ask more, he knew. The morning of departure came fast. The parking lot outside the veterans' post buzzed with the energy of old soldiers trying to recapture a piece of what they once were. Trucks idled, headlights cut through pre-dawn mist, and the air smelled of coffee, gasoline, and bravado. Jake held his clipboard again, inspecting gear as if the trip were a deployment. His own truck brimmed with supplies, coolers stacked with steaks, surplus tents, even a rifle case tucked into the bed as though the mountains required more than discipline and grit. Sarah arrived in her modest Civic. One pack, that was all. A sleeping bag strapped to the outside, her tarp rolled tight, her food neatly sealed. Efficiency, simplicity, strength hidden in silence. "Well, well," Jake announced, his voice carrying across the lot. "Look who showed up. Martinez, let's see what you've got." He pawed through her bag, pulling out her containers with performative disgust. "Lentil soup, quinoa. Jesus Christ, Martinez, we're not going to yoga camp." His laugh was sharp, meant for everyone else. "Where's your tent?" "I don't need one," Sarah answered evenly. "Tarp and bag, lighter, faster." "You'll freeze your ass off." "I'll manage." Jake sneered, but beneath it was something he didn't want to admit, the quiet awareness that her answers carried no fear. The others stood by, watching. Some smirked with him, some shifted, uncomfortable. But one thing was clear: Sarah would not be shaken. Robert Sterling, the official organizer, finally cut in. "All right, let's move. Jake, your convoy won. Martinez, you're with him." Jake's grin widened. His victory, he thought. Hours in a truck with her in the back seat, his voice filling the space, his dominance unbroken. Sarah climbed in without a word. The road wound upward, through rolling hills into ridges crowned with redwoods. The morning sun painted the mountains amber and gold. Sarah watched quietly from the back seat, her eyes scanning the terrain the way she always had: nodding slopes, water lines, escape routes, old habits, always alert. "Beautiful country," she whispered, more to herself than anyone. "Pretty enough," Jake grunted from the driver's seat. "But don't be fooled. These mountains kill the unprepared. Weather turns fast, trails wash out, people die out here every year." His words were meant to intimidate, to remind her. But Sarah only nodded, her face calm. She already knew the truth he tried to wield like a weapon. Danger doesn't shout, it waits. Quiet, patient. By the time the convoy reached the trailhead, the air was sharp with pine and salt from the distant ocean. The plan was clear. 10 miles in, camp 2 nights, 10 miles out by a different route. "Last chance to back out," Jake called as the group shouldered their packs. His eyes found Sarah's. "Once we start, there's no easy way down." Sarah adjusted her straps, tested her boots against the rocky soil. She didn't answer him. She didn't need to. The mountain loomed, waiting. And what none of them knew was that within 48 hours, it would demand everything she had and more. Why did his voice always have to echo over hers? The trail wound steeply into the redwoods, a narrow path carved by centuries of rain and stone. The air was damp with salt drifting from the Pacific, and the ground smelled of pine needles crushed under boots. 23 Marines, some older, some younger, all carrying the weight of years since their service, fell into formation like muscle memory. At the front, Jake led with his usual aggression, his pace punishing from the first step. He barked over his shoulder, "Keep it tight. No stragglers. We move like Marines, not tourists." Sarah settled into the middle of the column, her breathing calm, her rhythm steady. Her pack was lighter than most, not because she lacked preparation, but because she understood efficiency. One tarp, one bag, one set of food packed with intention. Every ounce mattered. She walked quietly, her boots finding the best ground without thought. After half a mile, Jake's voice rang again. "Everyone keeping up back there. Don't want anyone slowing down because they skipped steak for salad." A ripple of chuckles followed. Not everyone laughed, but enough did to feed his performance. Sarah kept her eyes on the ground ahead, her breathing unchanged. She had learned long ago that silence could be sharper than any retort. But Mike, hiking 2 places behind her, noticed something. She wasn't struggling. She wasn't even close. She was holding back. Mile after mile, she matched the group's punishing pace without breaking rhythm. Her steps were measured, her posture controlled, as though the trail were an old companion. When the path tilted upward into switchbacks, she moved with the same quiet grace, never rushing, never stumbling. It was Jake, ironically, who seemed to sweat harder than most. By midday, the group stopped at a ridge overlooking the ocean. The wind whipped against their faces, carrying the sound of waves crashing far below. Some dropped their packs heavily, groaning. Sarah set hers down with care, her movements economical, precise. Jake turned, scanning the group. Good pace, but remember 10 miles today, that's just the warm-up. Tomorrow the mountain gets real. His eyes landed on Sarah again. Martinez, you good, not too tired. I'm fine, she said simply. The words carried no boast, no edge, just truth. Mike caught her glance as he sipped from his canteen. He saw it again, that calmness, that unshakable control. And for the first time he felt a flicker of shame. He had believed some of Jake's words once, believed Sarah's quiet was weakness. Now, watching her walk with more endurance than half the men there, he knew better. The trail to camp grew rockier, the sun sinking low behind the ridges. When Tommy, broad and sweating under an oversized pack, slipped on a loose stone, Sarah's hand shot out instinctively. She caught the pack straps, stabilizing him before he went down the slope. Thanks, Tommy muttered, embarrassed. No problem. She let go as quickly as she'd grabbed, her tone gentle, as if to erase the sting of his stumble. But Jake saw. His jaw tightened. Sarah had moved faster than anyone else, and worse, she hadn't faltered under the man's weight. By the time they reached the clearing chosen for camp, the light had gone amber, filtering through the redwoods. The place was beautiful, a stream running nearby, the ocean's horizon visible through gaps in the trees. The group scattered, tents unfolding, fires being built, voices rising with relief at the day's end. Sarah's setup was simpler. She unrolled her tarp, spread her sleeping bag, and sat by the stream with a cup of herbal tea before most had finished fighting with their tent poles. Smart, Alex said from his wheelchair, which others had helped maneuver close enough. Sometimes simple's better. Sarah nodded, sipping quietly. But the peace didn't last. Dinner came, and with it division. Steaks sizzled on Tommy's portable grill, the smell heavy with smoke and salt. Bottles of beer passed from hand to hand, laughter rising around the central fire. Sarah sat apart, opening her container of lentil soup, steam curling into the night. Martinez, Rick Dalton called, waving on his fork. You sure you don't want some real food? This is what camping about. I'm good, she replied, her tone kind, unshaken. This is exactly what I need. Jake seized on it. See, this is what I've been saying, group cohesion, shared meals, shared values. You separate yourself, you insist on being different, it affects the team. The words landed heavily, not just on her, but on the others who watched, waiting to see if she'd answer. Sarah only took another sip, the firelight catching her calm expression. Then, unexpectedly, the youngest voice in the group spoke. Private Danny, barely 24, shifted uncomfortably before saying, maybe diversity makes us stronger. Different perspectives, different strengths. Isn't that part of it too? Jake shot him a glare sharp enough to cut, but before he could answer, Mike stood, stretching. Anyone up for a night hike? Ridge we passed a mile back, view should be incredible. Hands rose, Danny's, Tommy's, even Rick's, Sarah's too. Jake stayed back, claiming camp security, though his eyes betrayed the real reason. He wasn't ready to risk being shown up. The hike into the night was different. The air grew cooler, the forest alive with whispers of wind through branches. Sarah moved ahead, her boots quiet, her flashlight low. She navigated the dark as though her body remembered trails no one else could see. When Tommy stumbled again on a rocky patch, Sarah caught his arm, steadying him with ease. He stared at her in disbelief. Jesus, Martinez, you move like a ghost. She shrugged lightly. Infantry training. You learn to move quietly when your life depends on it. The ridge opened into a view that stole the group's breath. Below, the Pacific stretched endless, the lights of distant towns flickering like stars fallen to earth. For 30 minutes they sat together in silence, the kind that wasn't heavy but healing. Even Tommy and Rick looked at Sarah differently now, not as an outsider, but as someone who belonged. "This is why I love these trips," Mike said softly, his voice almost reverent. "Reminds you what really matters." Sarah nodded, her eyes tracing the horizon. She didn't speak, but inside something eased just for a moment. On the way back down, though, she noticed what no one else did. The wind had shifted. The air smelled of rain, carried from the ocean, heavy and insistent. The temperature was dropping faster than the forecast had promised. She filed it away quietly, the way she always did. A habit born of survival. Weather could change everything. Back at camp, Jake was still holding court by the fire, his voice louder than the flames. He told another story about toughness, about meat, about what it meant to be a Marine. The others laughed, though less freely now. But Sarah noticed something had shifted. Tommy and Rick glanced at her differently. Mike leaned closer when she passed, as though silently acknowledging what he'd seen on the trail. Even Danny, the youngest, watched her with something like admiration. She said nothing, she didn't need to. By 10, the group settled into tents. Sarah lay beneath her tarp, her sleeping bag cocooning her against the cold. She listened to the forest, the creek bubbling nearby, the restless groan of trees swaying in the wind. At 3:17 a.m., her eyes snapped open. She hadn't dreamed, she hadn't stirred, something had woken her. The wind had changed. It howled through the trees now, sharper, urgent. Rain tapped against her tarp, steady at first, then harder. Branches cracked in the distance, moaning under strain. She lay still, her breath slowing, listening, assessing. This wasn't the soft autumn rain the forecast had promised. This was a storm, fast, violent, dangerous. And then came the scream. High panic tearing through the storm, human. She was on her feet in seconds, flashlight in hand, her bare feet sure against the wet ground. Voices rose behind her in camp, confused, groggy. Jake's bark demanding order. But Sarah didn't wait. She ran. The scream came again, closer now. "Help, oh God, help us," Danny's voice thin with terror. 50 yards from camp, she found him, kneeling beside two motionless bodies pinned beneath the splintered wreckage of a fallen redwood. Mike groaning, blood seeping from his leg. Rick Dalton, silent, head bleeding heavily. Danny's voice broke. "The tree just came down, I tried." Sarah was already kneeling, her hands steady, her mind shifting into the cold clarity of triage. One man with a compound fracture, another unconscious with shallow breathing. Both bleeding, both critical. The storm howled above them. The trail turned to mud under her knees. And Sarah knew. This was no longer about arguments or meals or pride. This was life and death. And the mountain had chosen its moment. Why did everyone look to him when he had no answers? Jake pushed through the rain, his flashlight beam cutting through sheets of water. Behind him, Marines stumbled from camp half-dressed, their voices blending with the storm. Then they saw it. The massive redwood stretched across the trail like a fallen giant, its trunk wider than a Humvee, roots torn from the earth in a crater of mud and splinters. The smell of sap hung heavy, mixed with the sharper scent of blood. Mike was pinned beneath one branch, both legs crushed and bleeding. Rick Dalton lay sprawled nearby, his head split open, his breathing shallow and irregular. Danny knelt in the mud, his hands useless against the weight of the tree. "Jesus Christ," Tommy whispered, his voice swallowed by the storm. "How the hell do we move that?" Jake's flashlight beam jerked wildly as his hands shook. His instincts screamed to give orders, to assert command, but his mind found no answers. The tree was too massive, the weather too fierce, radios dead, no signal. "We need help," Jake barked. "Try your SATCOM. Tommy, get to higher ground, see if you can catch a bar. We need to call this in." Alex wheeled closer, water pouring down his poncho. He held up the communicator, shaking his head. "Already tried, storms blocking everything. No GPS. No signal, we're cut off." Silence fell, heavy as the rain. Sarah's voice broke it, calm and precise as she knelt beside Rick. Severe head trauma, skull fracture likely. He needs a neurosurgeon now. She shifted to Mike, fingers pressing against his pulse. Compound fractures, possible internal bleeding. He'll go into shock if we wait. She looked up at the circle of stunned faces. We can't stay here. Jake's jaw clenched. Then what? We're miles from the road, terrain like this. In this weather, impossible. Not impossible, Sarah said, her tone steady, deliberate. We carry them. Her words landed like lightning. The group stared at her, rain streaking their faces, fear in their eyes. Carry them. 5 miles through mud and rock in a storm. Tommy laughed, sharp, nervous. Martinez, no offense, but you weigh maybe a $120 soaking wet. Mike's 190, Rick's 200. You can't even. I can, she cut in. No raise in her voice, no tremor, just certainty. Jake stepped closer, his flashlight beam steadying on her face. For the first time since he'd met her, he looked beyond his prejudice, beyond her quietness, beyond the bowls of quinoa. What he saw unnerved him. You'll kill yourself, he said flatly. Even if you could lift them, you'll never make the distance. Maybe, Sarah replied, her hands already working into a harness around Mike's torso. But they'll be dead if we wait. The storm cracked above them, a tree groaning in the wind, threatening to fall. Time was running out. Sarah looked up, meeting each man's gaze in turn. District 2011. Patrol base was overrun. Medevac couldn't reach us. I carried Staff Sergeant Williams 3 kilometers with a bullet in my shoulder. He lived. Corporal carried me 2 clicks when I took shrapnel. That's how Marines survive. We carry each other. Her words cut through the rain like steel. Jake's shoulders sagged. His authority, his bluster, his years of dominance, all of it crumbled in the face of her calm resolve. For the first time, he couldn't command his way out of a crisis. He had to follow. What do you need? He asked quietly. Sarah tied the last knot, tested the harness. Light the trail, keep the others moving, and when I get back, be ready with Rick. Mike tried to protest, his voice tight with pain. Martinez, you. She crouched, steadying his weight across her back, testing the balance, adjusting the cords. She grunted once, then straightened, lifting him clean from the mud. His body slumped against her, heavier than stone, but her frame held. She turned toward the trail. Rain stung her face. Mud pulled at her boots. The storm howled. And she began to walk. The first 100 yards nearly broke her. Mike's weight pressed into her shoulders, each step sinking into mud that clung like chains. Her thighs burned, her breath came hard, her balance tested with every shift of the storm's wind. Martinez, Mike whispered, his voice slurred. This is insane. Talk to me, she answered, her breath controlled, each word timed with her stride. Stay conscious, keep talking. You're not human, he muttered, half delirious. Sarah said nothing. She counted her steps, found a rhythm, let muscle memory take over. Afghanistan had taught her this, the art of carrying more than anyone believed possible. One breath, one step, one more. Behind her, the others watched until the storm swallowed her. Jake stood in the rain, water dripping from his jaw, his flashlight beam wavering in the dark. For years he had mocked her. For years he had measured her worth in grams of protein, in the sharpness of her silence. Now, as she disappeared into the storm with a Marine on her back, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Irrelevance. Sarah pressed forward. The trail had become a river, rocks hidden beneath the rushing water. She placed each step with precision, shifting her weight to keep Mike steady. Her shoulders screamed. Her legs shook, but her breathing that stayed steady. She remembered other nights. Nights when the darkness carried voices that would never speak again. Nights when she had chosen silence over panic, movement over fear. Almost there, she whispered, though she knew they were. Not yet, not close, but words mattered. Breath mattered, hope mattered. At a switchback, her boot slipped. She dropped to one knee, Mike groaning against her. For a heartbeat, the world spun, mud, rain, the weight crushing down. Too heavy, too far, too much. Then another memory, her grandmother's garden, the smell of earth and leaves. Her voice, soft but firm, strength doesn't shout. It grows quietly until the world can't ignore it anymore. Sarah pushed up, legs trembling, balance regained. She kept moving. Back at camp, chaos simmered. Rick's breathing grew shallower. Danny's hands pressed desperately against the bandage on his head. Jake paced, barking orders that no one followed. His voice had lost its power. His words rang hollow against the storm. "Why is she doing this?" Tommy muttered, his voice breaking. "Why would she even try?" Alex answered from his chair, his tone steady. "Because Marines don't leave Marines behind, and she remembers what we forgot." They fell silent, even Jake. By the time Sarah crested the final ridge, her vision blurred, her legs numb. But below, through the storm, she saw it, the faint glow of headlights, their trucks waiting at the trailhead. Civilization. Help. She stumbled forward, step by step, until the gravel of the parking area crunched beneath her boots. At 6:23 a.m., she lowered Mike gently to the ground beside a truck. Her arms shook violently, her body on the edge of collapse, but her voice remained steady as she grabbed Alex's SATCOM. "This is former Corporal Sarah Martinez," she said, her tone crisp despite the storm. "I have a Marine with multiple fractures in need of immediate medevac. GPS coordinates are—" She rattled them off like she had 100 times before. Then she handed Mike a blanket, pressed her hand to his shoulder. "I'm going back." His eyes widened. "No, you can't, you'll kill yourself. No one can do this twice." She met his gaze, rain streaking her face, her eyes burning with fire. "Rick's depending on me, and Marines don't quit." Before he could answer, she turned and disappeared back into the storm. Back at camp, Jake sat in the mud, his hands pressed uselessly against Rick's wounds. For the first time in decades, he had no story to tell, no bravado to cling to. The storm roared, the mountain groaned, and the woman he had mocked was walking back through hell to carry another Marine on her back. And he knew, deep in the hollow of his chest, that the rest of his life would never wash away the shame of this night. How many times could a body break before the spirit gave out? Sarah's boots sank deep into mud as she pushed back up the trail. The storm had only worsened. Rain lashed sideways, wind roared through the trees, and debris scattered across the path. Her pack was gone, her body stripped of everything but willpower. At camp, Rick Dalton lay pale and still, Danny kneeling desperately beside him, his hands trembling. The fire had long since drowned, their tents collapsed under the storm. The men sat in silence, waiting not for orders, not for Jake's voice, but for the impossible return of one woman. And then she emerged. Her silhouette appeared through the sheets of rain, shoulders hunched, her face streaked with mud, her clothes plastered to her body. She staggered into the clearing, eyes burning with focus. Jake's jaw tightened. For a moment he thought she had come back to collapse, to admit defeat, but Sarah only pointed at Rick. "Help me lift him." No one moved. "Now," she said, louder this time, her voice sharp enough to cut through the storm. Danny jumped first, then Tommy, their hands fumbling beneath Rick's shoulders. Together they shifted his limp body toward Sarah. She crouched, her arms moving with practiced precision, wrapping cords around his torso, securing his weight against hers. Jake found his voice at last. "You can't, Martinez. You already carried, this will kill you." Sarah looked up at him, rain dripping from her lashes, her breath controlled. "If I don't, he dies." Her words left no room for argument. With a guttural exhale, she rose, Rick's body draped across her back, his dead weight pulling her spine into fire. The others gasped, but Sarah only steadied her stance, adjusted the cords, and started forward. Each step was agony. Her thighs screamed, her shoulders burned raw from the earlier carry. Her lungs pulled for air that felt too thin, too sharp in the storm, but her breath, steady, measured, refused to break. Behind her, the camp dissolved into stunned silence. Tommy whispered, "She'll never make it." Alex's voice, low but certain, answered, "You said that about Mike, too." What? The trail stretched like an endless test, every incline a wall, every rock a trap. Rick's weight sagged against her, his head lolling, blood still seeping from the wound above his temple. "Stay with me," Sarah whispered, her words broken between breaths. "Don't you quit, Dalton, don't you dare." There was no answer, just the sound of the storm, the rhythm of her boots, the crack of branches above. She remembered another night. Afghanistan. The sound of mortars pounding their outpost, the cries of men in the dark, the acrid sting of burning diesel. She remembered lifting Staff Sergeant Williams, her shoulder torn by shrapnel, her blood mixing with his as she dragged him step after step. She remembered the weight then. She remembered the silence. She remembered the way no one believed she could. And she remembered what it meant to prove them wrong. The path tilted upward into switchbacks, the mud slick as oil. Her boot slipped once, twice. She dropped to a knee, Rick's weight pressing into her like the mountain itself had chosen sides. Her breath came ragged, her vision blurred. "Too heavy," she muttered, her voice cracking. "Too far." For the first time, doubt clawed through her chest. And then a memory. Her grandmother's hands, weathered and gentle, pressing soil around a seed. Her voice, soft but certain. "Plants grow through stone. Roots find water through rock. Quiet strength wins where loudness dies." Sarah's jaw clenched. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself up. One step, then another. Back at camp, Jake stood in the rain, his fists clenched. He could not shake the image, Sarah disappearing again into the storm. Rick slumped against her like a rag doll. He thought of every insult, every jeer, every time he'd pointed to her plate and laughed. And now, as thunder shook the mountains, shame burned in his chest heavier than any storm. Danny turned to him, his voice trembling. "Sir, what do we do?" Jake opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time in his life, he realized leadership wasn't about orders, about control, about voice. It was about action. And tonight, the only one acting was Sarah. "We wait," he muttered, his voice hollow. 2 miles in, Sarah's body began to fracture. Her calves cramped, her knees buckled, her vision narrowed to a tunnel of rain and mud. She could taste blood in her mouth from biting down against pain. Rick groaned once, faintly, his body twitching against her back. She nearly wept with relief. "Good," she whispered, her lips trembling. "Stay with me, Dalton. You owe me a beer after this." Her boots slipped again. She slammed into the mud, face first, Rick's weight crushing her down. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The storm screamed above her, mocking her silence. And then something inside her snapped. Not bone, not muscle, spirit. She screamed into the mud, her voice raw, primal, tearing through years of silence. She pushed up, her arms shaking, her back burning. Slowly, inch by inch, she lifted him again. Her scream turned to a whisper, "Not today." And she moved forward. Hours passed like years. Each step was its own war. She no longer thought of miles, of distance, of rescue. She thought only of movement, one foot, then the other. By the time dawn broke, the storm had thinned into heavy rain. The trailhead lay just ahead, faintly visible through the fog. Sarah's legs gave out 50 yards from the trucks. She collapsed to her knees, Rick slamming against her back. For a moment she thought it was over. She thought she had nothing left. But then she saw them. Figures running toward her, paramedics, lights flashing through the mist, Mike on a stretcher shouting her name. And suddenly she wasn't alone. Hands lifted Rick from her shoulders. Arms caught her before she hit the ground. Voices blurred in her ears, paramedics, Marines, shouts of "We got him. We got her." She tried to speak, but no words came, only silence. And then blackness. But hours later, Sarah woke in a hospital bed. Her body wrapped in IV lines, her muscles screaming, her throat raw. Mike sat beside her, his leg in traction, his face pale but alive. "You did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You carried us, both of us. You saved our lives." Sarah blinked slowly, her lips parting. "I just carried Marines." Tears welled in Mike's eyes. Across the room, Jake stood silently in the corner. His uniform soaked, his face pale, his eyes hollow. For once he had no words. He only watched, his jaw clenched, shame carved deep into the lines of his face. Sarah closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her under again. And in the quiet darkness she heard her grandmother's voice. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why was the silence heavier than words? The hospital room hummed with machines, each beep marking time that Sarah barely noticed. Her body ached in ways she couldn't name. Her muscles throbbed with deep, bone-deep exhaustion. Every breath felt like a war her chest had to win. But what gnawed at her most wasn't pain. It was the stillness, the sudden quiet after the storm. She opened her eyes slowly, the light filtering soft through blinds. The sterile smell of antiseptic hung in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of cafeteria coffee someone had left behind. Mike sat in the chair beside her bed, his face lined with fatigue, his leg encased in metal and gauze. But he smiled when he saw her stir. "Hey," he said softly. Sarah's lips cracked into the smallest smile. Her voice was rough. "You're alive." "You made sure of that." He leaned forward, his voice breaking. "You carried me, Sarah. You carried Dalton. 5 miles through a storm. No one can believe it." She shook her head, her throat raw. "I didn't do it to be believed." Mike swallowed hard, his eyes shining. "I know, that's why it matters." The door creaked open. Jake stepped in, his uniform still rumpled from the trip, his face pale, his shoulders slumped in a way that betrayed something he never let anyone see: defeat. For a long moment no one spoke. The air between them crackled with everything unsaid. The years of mocking, the words sharpened like knives, the laughter at her expense. Sarah's eyes met his, calm, steady, silent. Jake cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. "Martinez, he faltered, swallowing hard. "I was wrong." The words hung in the air, heavier than the storm. "I thought strength was loud," he continued. "I thought it was about proving yourself, about standing taller, shouting harder, but you," his voice broke. "You carried them, you carried us, and I stood there, I did nothing." Sarah blinked slowly, her gaze unflinching. Jake took a step closer, his eyes burning with shame. "I mocked you for years, for your meals, your silence, your difference. And you," he stopped, his chest heaving. "You saved them, you saved us all." Her lips parted. For a moment it seemed she might speak. But instead she turned her eyes to the window, the sunlight breaking through clouds outside. Her silence was answer enough. Jake's jaw tightened. His throat worked against the weight in his chest. Finally he turned, leaving the room without another word. Later that afternoon the others arrived. Tommy, Danny, Alex, each of them walking softer, speaking quieter than before. They didn't come with jokes or bravado. They came with gratitude. Danny, the youngest, fumbled with his words. You didn't just carry them, you carried all of us. We saw it. We'll never forget it." Tommy, his voice rough, added, "We thought toughness was about who could lift the most or eat the most or shout the loudest. But you showed us it's about who shows up when it matters." Alex from his chair leaned forward, his eyes steady. "They'll talk about this for years, Sarah, but not the way talks, not with bluster, with respect, with reverence." Sarah listened quietly, her hands folded on the blanket. She didn't need their praise. She didn't crave their validation. But part of her, the part that had carried silence like armor for so long, felt something soften. "Just promise me one thing," she said finally, her voice low, her breath still heavy. They leaned in. Next time someone different sits at your table, don't laugh first. Listen first. The room fell quiet. Danny nodded slowly. Tommy looked at the floor, shame washing over him. Alex's eyes glistened. And for the first time, Sarah felt something shift. But outside, the storm had passed. The California sun returned, the world glistening as though nothing had happened. But inside, everything was different. Jake sat alone in the waiting room, his head in his hands. The storm still lived in him, not the one outside, but the one he had built his whole life on, the storm of pride, arrogance, and fear of weakness. He replayed the night in his mind, the sound of the tree falling, the screams, the chaos, and then her stepping forward when he couldn't, when none of them could. He remembered the way she lifted Mike, the way she carried Dalton, the way she walked into the storm not once but twice, with no guarantee she'd return. And he remembered how he had stood frozen. A man who had always believed himself, the strongest, realized he was the weakest. When the nurse called his name, he didn't move. He couldn't. His body sat heavy with shame. But Sarah's recovery stretched on. Bruises darkened across her shoulders and back. Her knees ached. Her muscles screamed even after days of rest. But the doctors said her heart was strong, her body resilient. Against all odds, she would heal. Mike visited daily, his gratitude endless. Danny brought flowers awkwardly every time, his cheeks red. Tommy apologized more than once, fumbling, ashamed. And Jake, he came once more. Late at night when the halls were quiet, when no one else would see. He stood by her bed, his hands clasped, his eyes hollow. "I can't undo it," he whispered. "The words, the years, the way I treated you, but I'll carry it. For the rest of my life, I'll carry it." Sarah stirred, her eyes opening briefly. She studied him, the weight of his guilt painted across his face. "You don't need to carry it," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence at last. "Just learn from it." Jake's throat closed. He nodded once sharply and left before the tears fell. Weeks later, when Sarah walked again without pain, the group gathered at the post. Not for a mission, not for training, but for something quieter. They didn't laugh as much. They didn't mock as easily. They spoke softer, with more pause, with more weight. And when Sarah entered, they stood. No speeches, no declarations, just respect. She sat at the table, her container of lentil soup before her. This time, no one jeered. No one rolled their eyes. Instead, Danny raised his glass of water and said quietly, "To strength, the kind we didn't see until she showed us." The others echoed softly. Sarah bowed her head, not for recognition, but for the simple truth of the moment. Because sometimes, the loudest change happens in silence. That night alone, she stepped outside. The air was crisp, the sky clear, stars scattered across the California sky. She breathed deeply, her body still aching but her spirit unbroken. She thought of the storm, of Mike's weight, of Rick's limp body, of the silence that had carried her through it all. And she thought of her grandmother's voice echoing through the years. "Strength doesn't shout, it doesn't boast. It carries, it endures, it remains." Sarah smiled faintly, closing her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. Why did the story spread faster than she could stop it? Sarah never sought the spotlight. She never wanted her name stitched into tales told across barracks or whispered in veteran halls. But stories, especially the ones born in silence, have a way of escaping. It began with Danny. Young, restless, carrying both guilt and awe, he told his brother over the phone. His brother told a friend. A week later, a small piece appeared in the local veteran newsletter. Former Marine carries wounded comrades 5 miles through storm to safety. The words were plain, no embellishment, but they carried weight. From there, the story grew legs. Podcasts picked it up. Forums repeated it. Soon, veterans across the country were asking who was she, what drove her. Sarah didn't answer. She let the world speak while she remained silent. At the VA hospital, strangers began visiting. Old men in wheelchairs, women with prosthetic limbs, young Marines with fresh tattoos and eyes too old for their years. They came not for autographs or pictures but to sit quietly in her presence. Some spoke, some didn't, but all left with the same look as if they'd witnessed something rare. Mike teased her once, half smiling. "You're a legend now, you realize that?" Sarah shook her head. "Legends don't bleed." He chuckled softly. "Then maybe that's the point." Jake kept his distance. He attended the gatherings, stood at the back of the rooms, his face shadowed. He never added to the stories. He never corrected them, never claimed part of them. He just listened. Sometimes Sarah caught his eye across the room. He would nod once, sharp, like a soldier acknowledging a command. But he never spoke more than a handful of words. That, she realized, was his burden to carry. The battalion reunion came in spring. A hall filled with old photographs, dusty flags, tables of beer and barbecue. Laughter echoed against the walls, but when Sarah walked in, the air shifted. Conversations hushed, heads turned. She wore no uniform, no medals, no fanfare. Just jeans, a plain shirt, her hair tied back. But the weight of her silence drew them like gravity. Tommy was the first to move. He raised his glass, his voice carrying, "To Martinez, stronger than the storm." The room erupted, glasses lifted, voices roared, but Sarah, standing quietly near the entrance, felt a strange mix of warmth and discomfort. When the noise settled, she spoke softly, her words barely reaching the back of the hall. "Don't raise your glass to me. Raise it to the ones we carried, the ones who didn't make it home, the ones who taught us what strength really means." Silence fell again, heavy, reverent, and then slowly glasses lifted once more, this time quieter, more solemn. Not for her, but for all of them. Later that night, Sarah sat outside the hall, the sound of laughter spilling into the cool air. The stars stretched wide above her, the same way they had on the ridge before the storm. Danny joined her, awkward, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "I wanted to thank you again," he said. "Not just for that night, for everything, for teaching us what we didn't see." Sarah tilted her head, studying him. "What did you learn?" He hesitated, searching for words. "That strength isn't about being loud or proving you're tougher. It's about showing up when it matters, about carrying more than just yourself." A small smile touched her lips. "Then you learned enough." He looked down, then back up. "Can I tell the story to younger Marines, to remind them?" Sarah paused. Her instinct was to keep it quiet, to bury it like so many other nights she had survived. But then she remembered her grandmother's voice. "What good is strength if it doesn't grow new roots?" She nodded once. "Tell it, but don't make it about me. Make it about what we owe each other." Danny's eyes glistened as he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Months passed. The story lived on, reshaped by each tongue that carried it. Some told it as a tale of endurance, others as a parable of humility. Veterans told it to their children. Teachers told it to their students. And somewhere in the retelling, Sarah's name blurred. She became a Marine, a woman, someone. And she was fine with that because it was never about her. It was about the act, the carrying, the reminder that in the darkest moments, strength isn't a shout, it's a step forward. One evening, she returned to the mountain. Alone this time, no group, no reunion. Just her boots on the same trail where the storm had nearly broken her. The forest was quiet now, the redwoods standing tall, their branches whispering in the breeze. She stopped at the place where the tree had fallen, the scar in the earth still visible, though softened by time. She knelt, pressing her hand against the soil. Closing her eyes, she whispered a single word. "Thank you." Not to the storm, not to the tree, but to the moment that had forced her to reveal the strength she had carried in silence for so long. She stood, breathed deeply, and walked on. The mountain no longer felt heavy. It felt like home. Meanwhile, across the country in small units and veteran halls, the story lived on. A sergeant in North Carolina told his recruits, "Strength doesn't look the way you think. Remember Martinez." A teacher in Ohio told her class, "Don't laugh at difference, respect it. One day it might save your life." And in California, young Marines on the same trail whispered to each other about the woman who carried two men through a storm. They didn't know her face, they didn't know her silence, but they knew the weight of her steps. And that was enough. Why did silence always outlast the noise? Months had passed since the storm, since the mountain tested them all. The laughter at Sarah's expense had long since died, replaced by a reverence too fragile for words. But for her, life returned to its steady rhythm. Work at the animal shelter, quiet meals, early mornings, long walks alone. To the world, she had become a story. To herself, she was still just a woman trying to live without leaving anyone behind. The whispers didn't reach her much anymore. She avoided the podcasts, the articles, the legends belonged to other people. She belonged to the quiet. And yet the world had changed. At the Veterans Hall, the same table once filled with mocking voices now fell silent when she entered. Not because they feared her, but because they had learned to listen. The jokes about her meals, her silence, her difference gone. Instead, a simple nod, a space kept for her, a respect unspoken but deeply felt. Jake sat at that table too. Older now, his eyes carrying storms of their own. He didn't mock, he didn't command, he simply watched. And when their eyes met, he offered a nod, a soldier's acknowledgement, nothing more, nothing less. On quiet evenings, Sarah often found herself on the shore, watching the Pacific roll in. The ocean reminded her of the storm, relentless, unforgiving, but also cleansing. She would sit with her boots in the sand, listening to the rhythm of waves and remembering the rhythm of her steps that night. Sometimes she wondered why she survived when so many hadn't, why she had been chosen to carry, to endure, to walk miles with another's life pressed against her spine. There were no answers, only silence. And maybe that was enough. One afternoon, she was invited to speak at a local high school. She hesitated, public speaking was never her way, but something in her told her the invitation mattered. She stood in front of a gymnasium filled with restless students, their attention hard to hold. She didn't bring slides, didn't wear her uniform, didn't list her accolades. She simply told the story. Not of herself, but of that night, the tree, the storm, the weight of another life across her shoulders. She spoke quietly, slowly, letting pauses stretch, letting silence carry weight. At the end, a girl in the front row raised her hand. Her voice trembled. "Why did you do it? Why not wait for rescue? Why risk your life like that?" Sarah thought for a long moment, her eyes soft. "Because Marines don't leave each other behind," she said. "Because sometimes you don't wait for someone stronger, you become the strength. And because, if I had fallen that night, I would rather have fallen carrying someone than standing still." The room fell silent. And in that silence, she knew the story had found new roots. Back at home, she kept living simply. Early mornings, quinoa and vegetables, the dogs at the shelter, a small life but a life that mattered. Every now and then Danny would call, or Mike would visit. They always wanted to talk about the storm, to thank her again, to remind her of the impossible things she had done. She would smile, change the subject, and steer the conversation toward them. Because to her the act wasn't about glory, it was about duty, and duty didn't demand applause. It demanded presence. Years later, the mountain looked different. The scar where the tree had fallen had almost healed. Saplings grew where roots once tore the earth apart. The forest whispered with new life. Sarah hiked there alone, her pack light, her steps steady. She reached the spot and paused, listening to the silence. She crouched, pressed her hand to the soil, and whispered once more, "Thank you." The wind rustled through the redwoods, like an old friend answering back. She stood, breathing deep, her heart steady. The storm no longer haunted her. It had become part of her. But in the end, no medals marked her act. No monuments bore her name. Her story lived not in stone or ceremony, but in the quiet shifts of those who heard it. In the way Marines treated the different one at the table. In the way young recruits learned to listen before they laughed. In the way strangers carried each other, not just in war, but in life. That was her legacy, not strength measured in muscle, not pride shouted in bars, but dignity carried in silence. But on her last evening at the Veterans Hall, she sat again at the table. No laughter at her expense. No jeers, just quiet respect. Jake, older now, raised his glass. His voice was soft, almost reverent. "To Martinez," he said, "not for what she carried, but for what she taught us all." The others echoed, their voices low. Sarah only smiled faintly, bowing her head. Because she knew the truth, strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't roar. It doesn't demand. Sometimes strength doesn't speak at all. It simply acts. And when it does, the world is never the same.